Somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico Territory, in the fall of 1869, U.S. Army soldiers picked through the wreckage of a fight they had just won. The Apache band had scattered into the arroyos, and the soldiers moved carefully through what remained of the camp, weapons ready, eyes on the shadows between the rocks. What they found stopped them cold. Not weapons, not food, not anything a soldier would carry. On the ground, near the center of the camp, someone had left behind a pile. A mound of fibrous, bloody material, dozens of small plugs, each one dark and sodden, discarded in careful sequence the way a surgeon discards spent dressings. The pile was roughly the size of a bushel basket. It told a story the soldiers had not expected to read. Someone in this camp had been treating multiple wounded men, carefully and repeatedly, in the middle of a running fight. They had changed the dressings again and again. They had worked methodically while the army was still on their trail. And then they had moved, carrying their wounded with them, leaving only this evidence behind evidence that a system of wound care had been practiced here, in the desert, by people who had no hospital, no trained physician, no carbolic acid, no medical school degree. A U.S. Army surgeon named E. Andrews was shown the pile and the abandoned instruments recovered from the camp's medicine man. He took notes. He published those notes in October of 1869 in the Chicago Medical Examiner. He wrote with the clinical honesty of a man who had seen enough wounds to know when something works. What he described changed how at least a few frontier doctors thought about medicine on the southwestern frontier. It would take decades for the rest of American medicine to catch up. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what frontier doctors saw when they looked at Apache wound care, you need to understand what American medicine looked like in the second half of the 19th century. It was not a reassuring picture. The Civil War had ended in 1865, and it had been, among other things, a catastrophe of infection. Somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 Union soldiers alone died not from bullets or cannon fire, but from wound infection, sepsis, gangrene, the spreading rot that turned a survivable wound into a death sentence. Army surgeons worked fast and hard, and they were not incompetent men, but they worked in conditions of profound ignorance. The germ theory of disease had been proposed, but not yet accepted by most of the medical establishment in America. Louis Pasteur's foundational work was in circulation, and Joseph Lister had begun publishing his research on antiseptic technique in 1867. But the practical adoption of those ideas in American surgical practice moved slowly, unevenly, and with enormous resistance from doctors who had learned their craft before germ theory and saw no pressing reason to change. What this meant in practical terms was that an army surgeon in the field might probe a wound with an unwashed finger, use instruments cleaned only between uses rather than sterilized, and dress the wound with lint that had been stored in an open box in a dusty tent. He was not doing this carelessly. He was doing it according to the best standard of practice available to him, and men died of it in enormous numbers. The infection rate in Civil War surgical wards was not a scandal, it was simply the expected outcome. Fever after surgery was considered a normal part of the healing process. Surgeons called it laudable pus when a wound wept with infection because it meant the body was responding. The language itself tells you how completely wrong the framework was. By the time the Apache Wars were in full swing in the late 1860s and into the 1880s, most frontier army surgeons still operated within this framework. They had the added burden of practicing in isolated posts with limited supplies, no colleagues to consult, no nearby hospital to transfer difficult cases, and patients who might arrive half dead after days on the trail. A wounded soldier brought in from a fight with the Apache in the Arizona Territory was a long way from any place that resembled the medical infrastructure of the East Coast. Whatever you knew, whatever you had in your kit, that was what you worked with. The forts themselves were not places of medical optimism. Fort Bowie, cut into the Dos Cabezas Mountains near Apache Pass, was a sun-hammered outpost that had been established in 1862 after a confrontation at the Apache Spring left soldiers dead and the water supply contested. Fort Apache, Fort Huachuca, Fort Grant, these were not hospitals with proper wards and trained nursing staff. They were operational military installations first, and the surgeon's room was wherever space permitted. The post surgeon might serve a garrison of a few hundred men spread across a territory the size of several eastern states, responsible for everything from extracting teeth to amputating limbs after combat, from treating scorpion stings in summer to managing pneumonia through desert winters that were colder than anyone back east expected. The Army's medical department had been trying to professionalize since the Civil War. It required formal examination of its surgeons and had established a system of medical officers that was, on paper, more rigorous than the civilian frontier. But even the best-trained Army surgeon in Arizona Territory in 1875 was working with a science that had not yet accepted germ theory, not yet standardized antiseptic technique, and not yet understood why the men he treated in his clean hospital tents sometimes did worse than the Apache warriors who had been shot in the same engagement and treated in the open desert with plants and fiber. Against this backdrop, what the frontier doctors observed about Apache wound care was not merely interesting. It was, in several specific respects, better than what they were doing themselves. To understand why this was possible, it helps to understand who the Apache were as a people and what their relationship with combat meant for their medicine. The Apache were not a single tribe, but a loose confederation of related bands: the Chiricahua, the Mescal, the Jicarilla, the White Mountain, and others, sharing language roots and cultural patterns while maintaining distinct identities and territories across the Southwest. They had occupied the terrain of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico for centuries before Spanish contact. They were, by the time American soldiers began pushing into the region in the 1840s and 1850s, among the most experienced guerrilla fighters in North America. Not because they were uniquely warlike by temperament, the record is more complicated than that, but because they had been in a near-constant state of defensive conflict with Spanish colonizers, then Mexican authorities, and then the United States Army, for over 200 years. 2 centuries of combat, in terrain that favored the mobile and the knowledgeable, against enemies who were almost always better equipped, but rarely better adapted. Apache warrior training was among the most physically rigorous on the continent. Boys began conditioning as young children, running long distances in the desert heat, learning to go without water and food for extended periods, swimming icy mountain streams in winter. By the time a young man was considered ready for raiding, he could cover 50 to 75 miles a day on foot across terrain that would exhaust a mounted soldier. They trained in the specific landscape where they would fight, learning every water source, every escape route, every ridge and arroyo and canyon that could be used for concealment or ambush. Accounts from Army officers who pursued Apache bands consistently express something close to astonishment at how quickly and completely Apache warriors could disappear into country that looked, to American eyes, like empty desert with nowhere to hide. This physical conditioning mattered for medicine in a specific way. Bodies trained to this level of endurance healed differently than bodies that were not. Men who could run 60 miles on a gallon of water and a handful of dried meat had physiological reserves that most American soldiers, weakened by garrison food and sedentary duty between campaigns, simply did not. When an Apache warrior was wounded and his medicine man packed the wound with mescal fiber and ash leaves and moved him through the desert, the warrior's body was doing a significant part of the healing work. The medicine man's job was to stabilize the wound and keep it clean. The warrior's conditioning did the rest. That combination, practical field medicine plus a body prepared by years of rigorous training, produced outcomes that looked, to outside observers, like something close to miraculous. What this produced in cultural terms was a community where the management of combat wounds was not an incidental skill, but a central, practiced, well-developed body of knowledge passed down through generations. Apache warriors expected to be wounded. They trained to fight through wounds. They trained their medicine men to treat wounds in the field, under pursuit, with the materials available in the desert. A medicine man who lost his patients died with a damaged reputation, and no one would ask him to carry the surgical kit into the next engagement. The selection pressure was real, and it was constant. What worked was retained. What did not was abandoned. Dr. Andrews's 1869 paper in the Chicago Medical Examiner laid out what Army surgeons had been observing about Apache military medicine for years. His account was careful and specific, and it is worth dwelling on the details because the details are where the real story lives. The Apache medicine man's understanding of wound danger, Andrews wrote, rested on a single central idea, that the primary threat from a wound was blood loss. This understanding had developed, he believed, over centuries of experience with arrow and knife wounds, where hemorrhage was in fact the immediate killer. The Apache had no knowledge of blood circulation as Western medicine understood it. They believed each part of the body held its own supply of blood, but their practical conclusions were not wrong. Stopping blood loss, quickly and effectively, was the correct first priority. The mechanism they had worked out to accomplish it was simple, and it worked. The medicine man carried two things onto the battlefield as standard supplies. The first was fresh boughs of ash, whose leaves would be placed directly against the wound. The second was mescal root, the same agave root that the Apache roasted and ate as food. When the nutritious part of the mescal root was chewed out, what remained in the mouth was a dense plug of woody fiber, something like coarse tow cloth. The medicine man would take a fresh ash leaf, lay it against the wound, and then pack a plug of chewed mescal fiber on top of it and drive the whole assembly into the wound. In arrow wounds, this worked well. The plug physically stopped the hemorrhage. The ash leaf served as a barrier between the plug and the tissue. What made this more than just improvised first aid was what came next. The medicine man changed these dressings repeatedly, working through multiple plugs until he was satisfied the hemorrhage danger had passed, then going deeper to fill the entire track of the wound with a fresh tampon. The bloody discarded plugs that the army soldiers found in the abandoned Apache camp, that bushel basket of cast-off dressings, were the physical evidence of this careful, repeated process. Andrews also documented the instruments recovered from the captured medicine man's kit. They were not what any American surgeon would have recognized as medical tools. There were 5 stones, carved from carbonate of lime, cut from pieces of stalactite. There was a seashell. Andrews described them with the puzzled respect of a man trying to understand a system he cannot quite read. The stones, he concluded, were likely used for pressure and manipulation of the wound area. The shell, its edge worked smooth, may have served as a scraping or clearing tool. The whole kit fit in a pouch that a man could carry while running. It was the surgical instrument set of a people who had learned to practice medicine while in motion, in the field, under fire. Andrews noted something else that he found harder to explain away. He had compared the Apache treatment of Apache wounded with what the army surgeons were doing for soldiers wounded in the same engagements. The Apache warriors, he wrote, seemed to recover more reliably. The wounds healed with less secondary infection. Men who had been shot came back into the fight, months later, who by any medical standard of the time should have died. He was not the only surgeon to make this observation. Army Captain John G. Bourke spent over 20 years on the southwestern frontier, beginning in the late 1860s, and he kept meticulous notes on everything he saw. Bourke was not a physician. He was a career infantry officer who served under General George Crook in the Apache campaigns, but he had a naturalist's instinct for observation and a journalist's drive to document what he witnessed. His 1892 monograph, The Medicine Men of the Apache, published by the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, compiled observations drawn from years of watching Apache healers work. Bourke had ridden with Crook through some of the hardest country in the Southwest, into the Sierra Madre of Sonora, following Geronimo's band in 1883, through the canyon country of the Tonto Basin, across the White Mountains in winter. He had seen wounded Apache warriors in the field, had watched medicine men work under conditions that would have challenged any practitioner, and he had made the same comparison that Andrews had made between the Apache outcomes and the Army outcomes, and arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. What Bourke recorded aligned with what Andrews had written 2 decades earlier. The Apache, he observed, were skilled at making splints from willow twigs, a material that was lightweight, easily sourced in the Southwest, and surprisingly effective for immobilizing fractured limbs. More than that, they met with what he called much success in their treatment of gunshot wounds. He noted specifically that Apache healers did not dress wounds as often as white practitioners did. They argued, he wrote, that the white doctor's habit of frequently removing and replacing bandages unduly irritated the wounds. This was a remarkable clinical observation. It anticipated by decades the modern understanding that excessive wound disturbance increases infection risk and slows healing. The Apache were allowing wounds to stabilize between interventions. They were, without knowing the bacteriological reason, reducing the opportunity for contamination. Bourke documented other practices. Apache healers drank and administered herbal infusions for fever and chills. They used a form of wet cupping, scarifying the skin and applying a vessel to draw blood to address certain injuries. They manufactured and used a kind of injection device from animal bladders and hollow bird bones to irrigate wounds and deliver medicinal preparations internally. Modern surgery of the University of Arizona's Department of Surgery has noted that this practice predated Alexander Wood's credited invention of the hypodermic syringe in 1853, though the dates and extent of these practices across different tribes varied. The Apache of the Southwest had been working with wound irrigation long before it became standard in American medicine. Bourke also noted the Apache use of the sweat lodge, not merely as ceremony, though it carried ceremonial weight, but as a deliberate method for raising body temperature in wounded men as a treatment for what we would now recognize as the early signs of infection. Whether this had meaningful clinical effect is not something that 19th century medicine could evaluate. What matters is the intent and the sophistication behind it. The recognition that the body's temperature response to injury was not just a symptom to be managed, but a process that could be directed. The logic was wrong in its underlying theory, but right in its practical orientation toward the body's own defenses. The broader pattern in Bourke's observations was not that the Apache had equivalent knowledge to trained Western physicians in every area. They did not. Their understanding of infectious disease was spiritual rather than biological, and some of their treatments, the ceremonial chanting, the elaborate ritual that accompanied medical care, reflected cosmological beliefs rather than any mechanism that Western medicine would recognize. But in the specific domain of traumatic wounds, cuts, arrow wounds, gunshot wounds, their practical record was better than the formal medicine that was being practiced in Army field hospitals in the same territory at the same time. The question that a few observant frontier doctors began to ask, quietly, was, why? If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The answer, though no one could have stated it in these exact terms in the 1870s, was a combination of environment and practice. The Apache lived in a world of extraordinary physical demands. They moved constantly, ate lean, slept in conditions of exposure that would have disabled many. But they also, crucially, lived outdoors in a dry climate, in environments where the bacterial burden on wounds was lower than in the close quarters of a military hospital or the crowded surgical tent. A wound dressed in the open desert air of Arizona, covered with clean plant material and allowed to clot, faced a different microbial challenge than a wound dressed in a ward where men with suppurating injuries lay 3 feet apart and the instruments were wiped rather than sterilized. The Mescal fiber plug, which Andrews had examined with a surgeon's skepticism, turned out to have more going for it than simple physical pressure. Later analysis of agave species would establish that several compounds in agave tissue have antimicrobial properties. The Apache had not identified these compounds scientifically. They had arrived at the treatment empirically, over generations, by observing what worked. The ash leaves used as a wound covering also had a long history in traditional medical applications across cultures. Whether the specific compounds in the ash leaf contributed to wound protection or whether the leaf primarily served as a clean physical barrier, the practical effect was to place something clean between the injury and the contaminated plug. What Andrews and Bourke saw was not magic. It was the accumulated result of centuries of practical wound management in a specific environment, refined by the brutal selection pressure of actual combat. A treatment that didn't work got abandoned. A treatment that reliably saved wounded men got remembered, taught, passed down. The Apache had been running this experiment for a very long time before any American surgeon arrived to take notes on the results. The medical establishment's response to these observations was, with some exceptions, indifference. Andrews published his paper in 1869 and it was read, discussed briefly in certain circles, and then set aside. The Army Medical Department had its own protocols, its own hierarchy, its own institutional momentum. A report from the field noting that Apache medicine men were producing better wound outcomes than trained surgeons was an uncomfortable document, one that implied the wrong things about the relative merits of Western training versus practical indigenous knowledge. Most of the men with the authority to act on such a report were not inclined to do so. Acknowledging it publicly would have required a degree of institutional humility that organizations rarely manage, and the Army Medical Department in the 1870s was no exception to that rule. The observations survived because individual men Andrews, Bourke, eventually Goodfellow chose to write them down anyway. The frontier doctor who took this most seriously, who built his entire career around the lessons that the Southwest had to teach about wound management, was a physician named George Emory Goodfellow. Goodfellow arrived in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, in 1880, just as the silver boom was at its peak and the town was becoming one of the most violently contested spaces in American history. He was 24 years old, trained at Worcester College in Ohio, restless and ambitious, and he had spent time as an assistant surgeon at Fort Whipple in Prescott, where he had treated every kind of injury the frontier could produce: rattlesnake bites, explosives accidents, wagon injuries, horse kicks, and the gunshot wounds that frontier military life generated with dispiriting regularity. He had also, at Fort Whipple and in his movements through Arizona Territory with Army campaigns, spent time in proximity to Apache warriors and Apache medicine men. He had learned enough Apache to hold a conversation. He had paid attention to things that other surgeons walked past without recording. Tombstone gave him material in quantities that no Eastern medical school could have provided. The town in 1880 was a place of roughly 2,000 people, most of them men, most of them there because silver had been found in the surrounding hills and money moved fast, and the law was thin and the saloons were full by noon. The mines ran around the clock. The feuds between the established cattle and ranching interests and the incoming miners and merchants generated a friction that ignited regularly. In the 12 months following Goodfellow's arrival, the town would see the OK Corral gunfight, a major fire that destroyed a block of commercial buildings, and a succession of shootings, stabbings, and mining accidents that kept his operating table occupied around the clock. He treated his patients where he found them. A man shot outside a saloon might be carried to Goodfellow's office on the second floor of whatever building he was currently using. A man shot in a mining camp 30 miles out might require Goodfellow to ride through the night, arriving to find a patient on a wooden plank surrounded by men who had done their best with whiskey and cloth but had run out of ideas. He operated on billiard tables, on kitchen floors, on blankets spread over packed earth. He used what was selfless healer who saved lives with improvised brilliance, or a quack with a bottle of whiskey and a bone saw. Both versions flattened the reality. The reality was more interesting and more disturbing. The gap between what the best frontier physicians understood about wound management and what the worst ones did was enormous. A man shot in Arizona Territory in 1880 might be treated by someone with genuine surgical skill and a hard-won understanding of wound cleanliness, or he might be treated by someone who had no license and had learned medicine by watching someone else for a season. The outcome depended heavily on which man found him first. What the Apache wound care observations added to this picture was not a romantic story of noble savages teaching ignorant doctors the secrets of nature. That framing would be both condescending and inaccurate. It was something more specific, documented evidence that a set of practical techniques developed over centuries by people who had been managing combat wounds their entire history produced reliable results. Results that Army surgeons, honest ones, were willing to acknowledge exceeded what their own training was producing in the field. The ash leaves and the mescal fiber plugs and the careful, repeated dressing changes and the relative restraint about disturbing healing wounds, these were not mystical. They were rational responses to the same clinical problem that American medicine was trying to solve, and in several key respects they were better responses, arrived at by the only method that ultimately works in medicine: observing what happens to real patients and drawing honest conclusions. Goodfellow understood this. Andrews understood it enough to publish it in 1869, when such an acknowledgement was not professionally advantageous. Bourke documented it with the scrupulous attention of a man who understood that what he was watching would not last, that the frontier medicine of the Apache would be disrupted and lost along with so much else as the Apache people were pushed off their land and onto reservations, as the warriors who had been trained in its application were scattered or imprisoned or killed. It is worth pausing here on what that loss meant. When Geronimo surrendered at Skeleton Canyon in September of 1886, the final formal end of armed Apache resistance in the United States, the surviving Chiricahua Apache were loaded onto trains and shipped east as prisoners of war. They went first to Fort Pickens in Florida, then to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, then eventually to Fort Sill in Oklahoma Territory. They spent 27 years as prisoners of war on American soil, moved from one unsuitable climate to another, dying in numbers from the tuberculosis and other diseases that flourished in damp, crowded confinement after a lifetime on the dry high desert. Roughly a third of the Chiricahua who had surrendered in 1886 were dead within 8 years. They had survived 2 centuries of warfare in the Southwest and were killed by the conditions of their imprisonment in the humid southeastern United States. The medicine men went with them. Their knowledge went with them, applied now to the novel horrors of captivity and disease rather than the familiar terrain of combat wounds. What had been refined over centuries to address arrow wounds and rifle shots in the arroyos and mountain passes of Arizona was carried to Fort Marion in Florida and Fort Pickens, in places whose soils and plants and dry air bore no resemblance to the land that had shaped it. Some of the knowledge survived the journey. Some of it was lost in the crossing, the way any living system loses resilience when the environment that sustained it disappears. Bourke had understood that this was coming. His urgency in documenting what he observed was not merely academic. It was the urgency of a man watching something he knew could not last and racing to write it down before it was gone. The record he left behind is imperfect, shaped by the limitations of a 19th century officer's perspective and the assumptions of his time. But the core of what he documented, that Apache wound care produced results that American medicine could not explain and in some cases could not match, is not a claim he invented. It is a claim that multiple independent observers, surgeons and soldiers and naturalists, made from direct observation over a period of 30 years. George Goodfellow left Tombstone in 1891, his 11 years in the Silver Town having made him the most knowledgeable gunshot wound surgeon in the country. The laparotomy technique he pioneered, operating on abdominal gunshot wounds rather than simply waiting for the patient to die, as had been the standard practice, became the universal standard of care for penetrating abdominal trauma. It remains the standard today. The sterile technique he insisted on, washing his hands, washing the wound, reducing contamination at every step, anticipated the acceptance of germ theory into practical American surgical practice by years. Every soldier who survived a gut shot in the World Wars, every accident victim whose perforated intestine was repaired in a modern emergency room, is alive in part because a doctor in Tombstone decided to wash his hands before cutting and had the stubbornness to keep doing it when no one around him thought it necessary. That chain of inheritance is not clean or simple, and history rarely is. The knowledge that fed into Goodfellow's practice came from multiple directions: from medical school, from battlefield experience, from the specific pressure of working in a place where failure was immediate and available. He improvised constantly, and through all of it, he kept his hands and his instruments as clean as he could manage, in an era when most of his colleagues considered that a secondary concern. The town had a dozen doctors, according to contemporary accounts, and only 4 of them held licenses. The other 8 practiced anyway, in a territory where no one checked and the work was constant. Goodfellow was among the licensed 4, and he became almost immediately the most capable surgeon within a very large radius. He was known, in the distinctly frontier way of physicians who worked in dangerous places, to his patients as simply document. He was also, in the judgment of the men who studied his case records decades later, a physician operating at a level of trauma care that would not become standard American practice for another generation. He is known today primarily through the connection to the Earps. He treated Virgil and Morgan Earp for wounds from the fight at the O.K. Corral on October 26, 1881. 2 months later, he treated Virgil again after an ambush that shattered the marshal's arm, removing 3 inches of bone from the humerus. He attended Morgan Earp after the assassination on March 18, 1882, and knew within minutes that Morgan would not survive. He testified in the subsequent court proceedings, and his clinical analysis of the wounds helped establish the Earp's account of what had happened that afternoon near Fly's photograph gallery. But the O.K. Corral is not where Goodfellow's real medical legacy lies. It is in the operating room, or rather in the billiard hall, the back of a saloon, the floor of a miner's cabin, wherever he was compelled to work with whatever he had available. He was the first physician in the United States to perform a successful laparotomy for an abdominal gunshot wound, operating on a miner in July of 1881 who had been shot 9 days before and had been given up for dead. Goodfellow washed out the abdominal cavity with hot water, sutured 6 perforations in the intestines with silk thread, and closed the wound. The miner lived. He wrote about it in a letter that captures his method. I was entirely alone, having no skilled assistant of any sort. Therefore was compelled to depend for aid upon willing friends who were present, these consisting mostly of hard-handed miners just from their work on account of the fight. The anesthetic was administered by a barber, lamps held, hot water brought, and other assistance rendered by others. Before Goodfellow, a gutshot man in Arizona Territory was a gutshot man, which meant he was dying. The conventional wisdom of American medicine held that abdominal gunshot wounds were inoperable, that opening the abdominal cavity to treat the damage inside was more likely to kill the patient than the wound itself. This was not entirely wrong as a practical assessment of what happened when surgeons with unsterilized hands opened abdomens in contaminated field hospitals. The surgery itself became the primary source of infection. Goodfellow changed that calculation by insisting on cleanliness at every step, and the miner on the billiard table in Bisbee, who should have died in 1881, lived because of it. What made Goodfellow different from his contemporaries was not just skill. It was his insistence on cleanliness at a time when most of American medicine still regarded wound cleaning as a secondary concern. He washed his hands before operating. He washed his patient's wound with lye soap or whiskey. He recognized, in practice if not yet in the language of germ theory, that contamination was the enemy. He had watched enough Apache wound care, in enough engagements with Apache warriors, to understand that something in their approach to keeping wounds clean was right. He could not have named the bacteria they were excluding. He could have told you that the men who got treated by Apache medicine men in the field came back healthier, proportionally, than the men who got treated in Army hospital tents. He had also made a discovery that seemed trivial but was medically significant. He noticed, in examining several patients who had been shot, that the silk of a handkerchief or a shirt appeared to resist bullet penetration in ways that other materials did not. He documented multiple cases, published a paper in the Southern California Practitioner entitled Notes on the Impenetrability of Silk to Bullets, and the discovery eventually contributed to the development of ballistic protection. Goodfellow had stumbled onto this because he was paying attention to what he saw, the way the Apache medicine men had paid attention to what they saw, and drawing conclusions rather than dismissing anomalies. He left Tombstone in 1891, after 11 years that had made him the most experienced gunshot wound surgeon on the continent. His records, his published papers, and his surgical techniques followed him. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Goodfellow went to Cuba as a military surgeon, operating under fire with the same methods he had developed in the silver country of Arizona. He treated wounded men at the same battles where Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders charged up Kettle Hill, and he did it with cleaner hands and better outcomes than almost any other surgeon in the field. By the time he died in Los Angeles in December of 1910, the laparotomy he had pioneered in a Bisbee billiard room had become so accepted as standard practice that many of his younger colleagues did not know who had first demonstrated it was survivable. The myth of the frontier doctor, as it has come down through popular culture, is a figure of either heroic competence or cheerful incompetence, either a personal. But it also came from years of proximity to a people whose own medical tradition had been solving the same problems longer than the United States had existed. That part of the inheritance is the part that rarely gets written down, rarely gets credited, rarely makes it into the obituaries or the textbook chapters on the history of trauma surgery. He had learned some of it in medical school. He had learned some of it by operating on dozens of men in the most difficult conditions imaginable. And he had learned some of it by watching, with the particular attention of a man who respected competence regardless of where he found it, the medicine men of the Apache working in the field. The Apache warriors who built their medical practice on ash leaves and mescal fiber and centuries of experience with wounds did not receive credit in any journal. Their names were not preserved in the way that Goodfellow's name was preserved. The medicine man whose surgical instruments 5 stones and a seashell, according to Andrews's account, were captured and examined by American surgeons in the 1860s is not known to us by name. But the logic of what they had developed was real, and it was picked up and extended by the best of the men who came after them. Men who had the humility to notice that someone was getting better results than they were and the honesty to say so in print. In medicine, as in most things, knowing what you don't know is half the battle. The frontier doctors who paid attention to Apache wound care knew something that their colleagues back east, in their clean hospitals with their confident protocols, did not know yet, that the desert had been teaching its own lessons in trauma surgery for a very long time before any American physician arrived to take notes on the results. The names worth remembering here are not just Goodfellow's, though his work was remarkable. They are also Andrews, who in 1869 had the honesty to write down what he saw and to say plainly that it worked. They are Bourke, who documented decades of observation and published it so the record would survive. And they are the unnamed medicine men of the Apache who carried their instruments and their ash leaves and their knowledge into the field through every engagement of those long and bitter wars, working methodically on wounded men in the middle of chaos, leaving behind nothing but a pile of bloody dressings and a record of results that their enemies found difficult to explain. Remember the names, and remember the ones we never knew. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.